Hello my friends, welcome to another video at the Lulu Blue Studio. My name is Luisa and today we are going to paint together this basic loose style flower composition. I'm going to walk you step by step and I will guide you through the process so you will learn how to create these loose style flowers and how to add layers. Let's start! So my recommendation for you when you want to start creating a loose style floral composition is to think at the basic shapes of the flowers you want to create. Just start by mixing on your color palette a light value of the color you would like your flowers to be. And in this case, for example, using a filbert brush, start to create in a very loose style just the petals of the flowers. We're going to start in this case creating the first flower in the center of this paper, and as you can see I'm creating just a very light value of this pink color, and I am creating an approximate shape of what my main flower will look like. As you can see, I'm using the side and the belly of this brush and I'm creating very light brush strokes all over this page. Adding a more concentrated pink, this is magenta, I am going back into the center of this flower where the first layer of paint is still wet, and I'm adding a few brush strokes that through the wet on wet technique will blend perfectly with the first layer. So this is my first recommendation for you when you want to create a similar flower composition to the one that we are creating today. Just start with the first layer in a very light value. That means that the pigment, the concentration of the pigment onto your brush is not very high and there is a higher amount of water. Just create an approximated shape of the flower you want to create. You don't need to be too precise. And then try to add more brush strokes, more concentrated, for example in the center part of the flower or in the outer part of the petals, while the first layer of these petals is still wet. You will add these brush strokes through the wet on wet technique, and the results are going to be stunning when the whole composition is going to be completely dry. In this moment, I'm adding a second flower and I'm using a similar technique. I mixed on my color palette a little bit of magenta and yellow ochre, and with this light value of pink, I'm using the side of my filbert brush and the belly of my brush to create these light brush strokes all around the center of this flower. I add a few concentrated brush strokes of red, this is Scarlet Lake, mixed with a little bit of magenta and yellow ochre, and I try to give an accent to these petals by adding a few brush strokes all over the flower. You can keep refining the shape of your flowers. Don't be afraid to add brush strokes until you achieve an overall shape that you are satisfied with. I imagine this second flower to be a sort of a peony, and it's quite close, let's say, and I see the side of the peony where some of the petals are falling down and some of the petals are instead quite straight on, and there is the crown all around these petals that I'm trying to define in this moment. I'm still using a very light value of my pink color. I keep in mind sometimes to add a little bit more yellow ochre or a little bit more magenta in order to change the color overall, which is called the color hue. And when I'm satisfied with this shape overall, I started to create a third flower on the upper right corner. I proceed in the same way. In this case, I'm using still a pink color that is a mixture of magenta with a little bit more red, Scarlet Lake, And I keep creating this shape of, it's a sort of a bud, in this case this flower, and occupies the upper right corner where there is a smaller area available of white space. Therefore the size of this bud is a little bit smaller compared to the other two flowers I've created. I add a few brush strokes of Scarlet Lake, and I give a little bit of an accent to these outer petals of this third flower. In this tutorial I'm using a filbert brush, but if you don't have one of these brushes available, I encourage you to use a round brush. So at this point, the main space on this page is quite filled, so I started to create the leaves. And in order to do so, I use my round brush from Princeton. This is an heritage brush in size 12, and I take a little bit of Sap Green and I mix it on my color palette to start to create a little bit of leaves. Leaves are in very loose style, and in order to create these leaves, I just create a little bit of pressure on the page with this brush, and I use the whole shape of this round brush to create these loose style leaves. I basically touch the paper with this brush, I add a little bit of pressure on the belly, and I release the pressure. My suggestion for you when creating a composition similar to this one, which is quite heavy in leaves, is to remember to change the color hue and the color values for these leaves. To change the color value means to have different concentrations of your pigments on your brush, so you can achieve lighter color values by removing part of the pigment in the cup of water, or you can achieve darker color values by having a high amount of pigment on your brush. You can also change the overall color hue. Changing the color hue means to change the color overall of, for example, the green that you have on your brush. And in order to do so, I encourage you to mix different amounts of, for example, green with, for example, a little bit of red or yellow ochre, in order to create different shades, different colors of green overall. Another suggestion that I want to give you when you are going to create a composition similar to this one and is going to be filled with leaves is to give to the leaves different sizes. That means some leaves are going to be bigger in size, but remember to also add a few leaves that are just smaller and can be achieved by touching the paper just with the tip of your brush. Through the wet on wet technique, you can add to wet leaves some other brush strokes when the paint is still wet, and therefore you can achieve beautiful blends of different types of greens, one on top of the other. My recommendation for you is to mix the green with some of the colors that you have used to create, for example, your flowers. For example, in this moment, I'm mixing a little bit of magenta with the green in order to create a darker sort of green that is a little bit more muted compared to the green as it is, that is Sap Green, which is quite bright as a sort of green. This will allow you to have different color use with a limited color palette. For example, if you have only one type of green, you can mix it with, for example, the red of the flowers and obtain different sort of greens, different types of greens. But this will also allow you to remove, let's say, the gap between the green and, for example, the red of the flowers that you have just painted. So, for example, in this case, we have red flowers, therefore I'm mixing a little bit of, for example, magenta with my green. But if you are creating a composition with orange flowers, for example, you can mix a little bit of orange with your green, and so on. I often like to mix my green also with the blues that I have on my color palette. I usually have Prussian Blue and Phthalo Turquoise, which are two dark blues which allow me to create a very deep sort of green that I like to add usually at a second stage, like I am doing now, after I've created the first layer of leaves on my compositions. I have the feeling these darker leaves created with the blue will allow my flowers to pop from the page. At this point, with the same brush, I'm mixing a little bit of magenta with a little bit of cobalt blue, and with this very light purple color, I'm going to start to create the second layer on top of the first layer of the petals. I'm using just a very light pressure and a little bit of the side of my brush and the tip of this brush to create these brush strokes where I imagine the shades of these petals being positioned. I also like to add on this second layer, when this is still wet, a few brush strokes just with the tip of the brush, in this case, for example, in color red. And so the red in this case is going to blend with the underneath layer of wet paint. I usually like to create this second layer in colors that are quite similar to the first layer. So in this case, I'm going to create a second layer as a mixture of magenta, for example, with a very tiny bit of blue. This is cobalt blue. But then sometimes I also like to add a few strokes, like now, of a very different color, like for example, Scarlet Lake, just to give a few brush strokes of accent color that is a little bit different from what I've been using up until now. If you use the tip of a round brush, you're going to achieve a very fine brush strokes. If you're going to use the belly of your brush and a little bit more pressure, your brush strokes are going to be a little bit bigger. I encourage you to try different brush strokes, for example with a round brush. This is the brush that I use most often to create this second layer. And don't be afraid to try to mix different colors on your color palette and add different brush strokes compared to the colors that you've used for your first layer. With practice and with a little bit more experience, you will be able to understand which colors you want to mix on your color palette and which colors you want to have on your painting. Also keep in mind that the second and the first layer appear quite different in the moment the whole painting, the whole composition is going to be completely dry. So the colors are usually a little bit less full, less saturated, and the composition becomes a little bit more subtle. In this moment, I'm creating the second layer of paint on the second flower, and I'm proceeding in the way I've described for the first flower. So the first layer is created with a mixture of a little bit of magenta and cobalt blue, and I'm adding on the second layer a few brush strokes of concentrated Scarlet Lake in order to give some vivid lines on these petals. Remember that you can mix on your color palette the color that you want to mix on your petals, but you can also mix directly through the wet on wet technique concentrated amounts of, for example, magenta, and then right after, for example, blue, like cobalt blue, directly onto the paper. Usually following this second approach, so mixing directly onto the paper two very different colors, will allow you to have very different blends where these two colors are quite predominant. Take your time to understand where to add this second layer and where you want, for example, to have some blending effects on the second layer, adding a few more concentrated brush strokes. And when you are satisfied with the second flower, proceed to add this second layer on the third bud that we have created on the upper right corner of this page. When I'm satisfied with the second layer applied on the petals, I just add a few additional brush strokes onto the leaves, and I'm using a smaller brush, so this is a round brush in size 6, and I do so with a dark green in order to create a variety of leaves with different dimensions. So while in the beginning I've created leaves with a big brush in size 12, now I proceed creating just a few leaves on top of the first layer with a smaller brush in order to have these different effects. Remember to change the color value, so the amount of concentrated pigment that you have on your brush, and also the color hue, so the color overall. In order to do so, you can just mix different percentages of colors on your palette. And when you are happy with the results on the leaves, you can proceed creating the center of these flowers. I'm mixing a little bit of Prussian Blue and black because I want a black center that pops up from these flowers. And I created the center as a circular shape where the inner part of the center is not completely filled with black, but I leave some white space that comes from the page underneath. For the peony on the upper left corner, I just create with the same mixture of black and blue a few dots that resemble the center of this flower. I proceed in the same way for the third bud on the upper right corner of the page, and we have actually achieved the end of this tutorial. Thank you for following along. If you like this video, press like and subscribe to this channel. It really means a lot to me. Bye!